Okay, so if you don't listen to George Rabb's Geologic podcast, I highly recommend that you do. I can't really describe what his show's really all about, mostly because it's really just a mixed bag, kind of like this, I guess. But if you do listen to him and you've noticed some similarities, well, that's on my part kind of accidental, but nothing I'll apologise for, as Geo's one of the main reasons and the main inspirations for me starting this whole thing in the first place. And when I'm feeling shitty about something, his stories tend to make me smile just a little bit. Anyway, you may have guessed this by now, as this is the second time in as many months something Geo has said on his podcast has inspired a story for me to do on this show. Anyway, none of that's important right now. On Geo's latest episode, he talked about how much stability he has had in his life and how grateful he feels to have it. Living in the same apartment for decades, parents still living in the same house that Geo grew up in, stable extended family, etc., etc. All the things that people who don't have these things long for or covet, like me, for instance, sometimes. And without talking to anyone, or Geo for that matter, that's had a similar life, I think it's fair to say that if I told them about my life that I had had and the experiences that I have had, they would probably say that they wish that they had my experience. And a big part of this is that we generally don't talk about the bad things in life, and the badder the things are, the further back it goes into the story of my life repertoire. For instance, we just had Armistice Day, and apart from the vulgarity of local officials making the beaten and battered ex-servicemen and women, octogenarians and other genarians included, stand at attention while the local officials drink tea with a side serving of ignorance in the nice warm town hall, it's a day for servicemen and women to remember, reflect, and most importantly, tell the stories of wars and comrades past, and to comment on how soft today's military is and what the fuck the actual airfares do anyway. But the bad stories stay tucked away where they belong. They've been told once before, and that's one time too many. And we all know the funny stories are embellishments anyway, or somebody else's funny story that was adapted to fit another situation. But the guys have earned that right, more than earned that right. And I know from my own experiences it's hard, and it takes a bit longer than that I've had so far to get over the bad stuff, or at least be able to make some sort of sense of it all. My point here is that the stories we tell are not the full account. We leave the bad shit out. So what if you could erase all the bad shit that's happened? Would you do it? Let's have a think about it. Remember when you were a teenager and hair was starting to grow all over your body where you thought that you wanted it, but now you spend the rest of your life shaving that same hair away? Well, that's about the same time we all had our first love. I'm not talking about a crush. I mean actual first love. And you remember that feeling. It was actually painful thinking about that person, especially if they didn't know that you even existed. And then, eventually after all the stalking and carving of initials into your desk at school and all the wishing and hoping and praying and mixtapes, he or she finally notices you. And, as it is with all good things, eventually it ends. For me it was weeks, for others it's months or years, and for the very lucky few, it is until death. But it ends. Everything ends, and it hurts like fuck. Okay, I've had broken hearts and I've had broken bones. Physical pain, a broken bone, is a signal to your brain telling you that you have a boo-boo and you need to do something about it. And you need some treatment and maybe a hug off Nana. Mental pain, physiological pain, is your brain telling your body that you are human. Psychological pain is an inescapable aspect of human existence. To be human, you have to have mental suffering and torment, and it hurts. But let me ask you that question again. If I offer you a blue pill and you take it, you will wake up in the morning and all the pain will be gone. No first heartache, no memories of failed marriages, no bullets, no bombs, no heartache when you have to say that last goodbye to the person that helped shape your life and brought you a cup of tea or some soup, or made you feel safe and well and gave you a kiss and a hug when you had a boo-boo. The person that made you feel good when your first true love dumps you after 2 weeks. Or better yet, you can erase the memory of when that special person in your life tells you they can't do anything else. It's terminal. Do you take the pill? Don't answer yet. Garth Brooks has a song called The Dance, and the story in the song starts with a couple sharing a dance, hence the very clever name. And he describes a feeling of everything being right. He's on top of the world, but it wouldn't be a shitty country song if the relationship didn't end somehow. But the message is that if you know how it's going to end, would you change things? Would you even bother with the relationship? Would you even bother visiting Nana? Would you bother chasing that one first true love? The punchline to the song is that he could have done without all the pain, but then he would never have had that first dance. So if you take the pill, everything is gone. There's no dance. There's no mass injection of adrenaline when she briefly touches your hand while you're lined up to go into science class. There's no euphoria when you see someone across a crowded room. No feeling of the room emptying except for you. You can take the pill and the memory of the two awful divorces are gone. They never happen. But with it goes everything that happened to lead into the wedding in the first place. Okay, so he's a no-good deadbeat plowboy with no row to hoe now, but it wasn't always like that. When it started, it was mixtapes and roses and carving of initials into your skin. You can take it all away. You can take away the heartache and the heartbreak, but you also have to take away the memories of holding your baby for the very first time and seeing them grow up into little mini-humans with their own pains. You'll never see the look on her face when you get down on one knee, or the fear in his eyes when he takes the ring out of his jacket pocket. You can take away all the bombs and the bullets and the death and destruction, but this will erase the families that were freed from tyranny and the wells that you helped dig and the schools and the villages that you helped build and the medicine that you delivered to save thousands of babies from a life of crippling disease. It will erase the smile on the war orphan's face when you show up with a truckload of donated toys on Christmas Day. Again, do you take that blue pill? Do you erase the memory of Nana slipping you a few quid or Grandpa sneaking you a sip of his whiskey and telling you your first dirty joke? All that so for just a little while, you don't have to face the things that makes us human. Yes, it hurts, but everything that hurts is linked to something wonderful. Don't take the pill. Hello and welcome to episode 43 of Skeptic Smash Talk, your weekly podcast full of news from the world of science, religion and politics. I'm your host, Jason Jones. And on today's show, we have political news looking at the latest fallout from the US general election. In skeptical and humanist news, I'll talk about the war on drugs and the war on women's rights. And I may even find some time to take a poke at religion. And just because I know you've all been wanting to know, we can all take a look together and see if we can figure out what Brexit actually means. Also, while I'm here, as you know, I don't normally give explicit content warnings anymore, but I also know I now have listeners who can get in a bit of trouble if their local authorities know what they're listening to. So please, if you're in one of those locations, especially this week, please take care, and it's probably best to keep your headphones on, so please be careful. That being said, if you want to play along at home, all the links to all the stories and further reading are in the show notes, and you can find them at skepticsmashtalk.com, as are all the contact details and links to all the social medias. So, without any further gilding of the golden flower, let's get on with the show.
Who is it?
Guess who's here? It's the President of the United States.
I didn't call a plumber.
So, no matter where you look right now on the internet, everyone still seems to be saying, nah, he won't do that. It's all talk. Well, when he said that he moves on them like a bitch, when he said he grabs them by the pussy, he and everyone else said it was all talk. Except it wasn't just talk, was it? There's a dozen or so women now that have all come forward and confirmed that this is, in fact, his modus operandi. But do you remember when he first slithered down the elevator, surrounded by the paid actors, when he announced that he was running for the Oval Office? How many people thought it was a joke? How many people said, oh, he isn't a serious candidate? How many of them were laughing when state by state he started winning in the primaries? And one by one, the 16 other clowns dropped off the tail end like Skittles in a Trump-nado. And when anyone got close to him, he moved on them like a bitch. First, he gave them an embarrassing nickname, then he would destroy them. And credit where it's due, he may be an absolute failure in everything he has ever done, but he had a fair talent for destroying his competition. But to be fair, that's like me entering into a scrotum volume competition with 16 eunuchs. And to continue that analogy, that's exactly what President-elect Dum Dum did to his rivals. He politically castrated them. Look at what he did to Chris Christie. He said to him, you've had enough donuts. There's the plane, Chris. On your way home, son. And what about the Ted Cruz? Attack after attack after attack. Trump punched him all around the ring, even taking shots at lying Ted's wife, until on the 3rd of May, Ted's trainer threw in the trowel and the last real potential opponent was gone. But after Tedley refused to endorse Dum Dum, even at the convention, he wouldn't say it. He wouldn't endorse him. But then we see lying Tedley phone banking for Dum Dum, castrated like a grumpy calf. Anyway, to my point, the Trump natives swept through the nation with promises of walls and deportation units and prisons for his rivals, and the reversal of all of Obama's executive orders. And, well, let's just call it what it is. He promised to whitewash the nation. Was this also just locker room talk? If it is, what then? 60 million people voted for him, presumably, on his election promises. What's going to happen if he doesn't deliver on all of the promises that he promised his supporters? What will they do then? Well, deliver or not, Trump in the Oval Office is going to be a disaster, the biggest and best disaster in US history, and it's gone past just rhetoric now. Because a professor has been arrested and questioned for mental health issues after tweeting a proposition on the Second Amendment, and a history teacher was suspended for drawing historical parallels in much the same way I and many others have. Now, this was reported in openculture.com. It reads, Frank Navarro has taught history at Mountain View High School for 40 years. He's an expert in the Holocaust, having been named a Mandel Fellow for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1997 and studied at the International Center for the Study of the Holocaust in Jerusalem. Until last week, Navarro was co-teaching a World Studies course built around this lesson plan, and it reads, the purpose of this course is to develop an understanding of the historical, geographical, political, economic, and cultural contexts that together create the modern world. Students will focus on the major turning points and dynamics that shaped global history from the late 18th century to the outbreak of World War II. We will follow the state curriculum standards for world studies for our subject matter, including foundations of global civilizations, Enlightenment revolutions, the Industrial Revolutions, new imperialism, World War I, and the rise of totalitarianism throughout the Holocaust. And it was in this context that Navarro drew parallels between Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump, citing how both political figures, as candidates, promised to expel foreigners and make their countries great again. What Hitler said about the Jews has a remarkable parallel to Trump's comments on Latinos, blanks, and Muslims, Navarro told the San Jose Mercury News. He's also very quick to add one important caveat. He's not saying Trump is the same as or equivalent to Hitler, or that he would govern like Hitler and commit the same atrocities. That would be sloppy historical thinking, says Navarro. But there are parallels in the racist political rhetoric, which is worrisome and worth comment alone. But if it's not bad enough that his fellow countrymen in the land of the free are talking like this, it makes you wonder what the leaders of the lands of the not-so-free are saying. Well, you don't need to wonder anymore. Taliban commanders and Islamic State supporters have said the rhetoric that Dum Dum uses during his campaign will help their recruitment efforts, especially among dissatisfied young people in the West. This guy is a complete maniac. His utter hate towards Muslims will make our job much easier because we can recruit thousands. One of ISIS's top commanders in Afghanistan told Reuters, "Our leaders were closely following the US election, but it was unexpected that the Americans would dig their own graves, and they did so," the ISIS commander continued. Okay, now that's a pretty shitty situation to be in right there, isn't it? One of the top ISIS commanders is feeling a bit sorry for the people of America. But it doesn't get better. A senior Taliban commander in Afghanistan said the group had kept a track of Mr. Trump's speeches and anti-Muslim comments and said if he, Trump, does what he warned in his election campaign, I'm sure it will provoke Muslim communities across the world and jihadi organizations can exploit it. Again, you can read that however you like, but that's an actual warning from someone that's supposed to be an enemy of the West. It's not a threat by any means. Al-Qaeda has not yet commented on the Fat Orange Joffrey's win. However, an advisor to the Iraqi government on Sunni jihadist movements told Reuters that Al-Qaeda is known for its recruitment strategy that heavily quotes speeches of the White House and other Western officials. Iraq's powerful Shia Muslim cleric Muqtada al-Sadr said in a statement, he, referring to Donald Trump, does not differentiate between extremists and moderate Islamist trends, and at the same time he overlooks the fact that his extremism will generate extremism in return. Nevertheless, Dum Dum is planning his Muslim registration scheme. The Secretary of State for Kansas, Chris Kobach, said that President-elect's advisors were looking at how to implement a proposal that would force immigrants from Muslim countries to register on a database. Kobach, who helped devise tough immigration laws in a number of US states and claims to have participated in regular conference calls with Dum Dum's immigration advisors, also said that the Trump administration could push ahead rapidly on construction of a US-Mexico border without seeking immediate congressional approval. Kobach, whose role has not been confirmed by the president-elect's transition team, but who is thought to be a favourite for the role of Attorney General, said the immigration group had discussed drafting executive orders for the president-elect's review so that Trump and the Department of Homeland Security could hit the ground running. And that's a really nice choice of words there, isn't it? Anyway, the Muslim registration scheme, which would reportedly see Muslims given a form of identification that notes their religion, obviously reflects policies Trump put forward during his campaign to introduce extreme vetting of Muslims through tougher security measures. In an interview last Saturday, President-elect Dum Dum told CBS he would deport 2 to 3 million undocumented immigrants immediately upon taking office and confirmed he still plans to build his wall, although he added that some parts of the barrier would now, in fact, be a fence. Kobach reportedly said in the interview that he believed that illegal immigrants in some cases should be deported before a conviction if they've been charged with a violent crime, echoing Trump's recent pledge to remove immigrants with criminal records who are in the country illegally. And how handy would that be? I think it's called a witch hunt. No trials, just dunk them in the creek, and the ones that don't drown are guilty. Anyway, let's go back to the history teacher and the lines drawn between the little mustachioed corporal and the fat orange Joffrey. This was reported late November last year from The Independent. November 2015. Donald Trump has confirmed his plans to force Muslims in the United States to register on a database and refused to respond to comparisons between his policy and the treatment of Jewish people in Nazi Germany. The frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination was confronted about the scheme, which would see Muslims given a form of identification that notes their religion, by a reporter from NBC News while signing autographs after a rally in Iowa. The reporter asked whether all Muslims in the US would be forced to register. They have to be, replied Trump. They have to be. He was then asked 4 times by another reporter how his plan for a Muslim database would be different from Nazi Germany's laws that required Jews to register. Dum Dum repeatedly said, "You tell me. You tell me." But as they say, there's a silver lining to the fat orange cloud. And that's because the Jewish and Muslim communities in America are now working together to fight against the hate and abuses that's spreading across the nation. 2 high-level organizations representing the interests of Jewish American and Muslim Americans, respectively, have announced plans to band together to create a new cross-faith council in America jointly to man the barricades against religious persecution and discrimination. The announcement comes as minorities of all kinds in America, including religious communities, are in high trepidation that the incoming administration will imperil progress made on combating discrimination and intimidation in society. Discussion on launching the new council was started several months ago by the members of the Islamic Society of North America and the American Jewish community, announcing its creation last week. Its founders were very careful not to specifically name President-elect Dum Dum or identify his rhetoric on the campaign trail as the reason for its creation. Bob Silverman, director of the Muslim-Jewish relations at AJC to Court, said, "This was not a reaction to the election. We saw a strategic need for these 2 communities to come together. They've been working on parallel tracks on many issues, so why not work together?" Okay. So as much as they say that this is nothing to do with President-elect Dum Dum, I have a bit of a gut feeling they are saying that to avoid any potential trolling. Personally, I don't really care what the reason is for this. I just care that this is happening and it's about time. And if it even marginally relates to the election of a fascist to bring these 2 groups together, then I'll take that. Which brings me to my next thought. What happens if the electors decide not to put him into office, the faithless electors? Okay, so I should start with this is probably never going to happen, but let me explain why. Well, if enough electors decide to go faithless, this means the vote is against their pledge. And this has happened in the past, but in recent history, I don't think it's had any major effect. And this time will probably be the same because, as I say, if enough electors go rogue, the decision then goes to the House of Representatives to decide. And being that the House has a Republican majority of about 60 seats, it's unlikely that the result will go back to the Democrats. But as we have all learned, 2016 has brought about some strange realities. So I'm not putting all my cards down for anything right now. But I have some real fears that if this does happen, and I think the fence-sitting electors will be thinking about the same thing also, remember that before the 8th of November, all of the far-right nuts were showing us all of their guns and arming up and threatening to march on Washington if Hillary wins. Well, obviously, that didn't happen. But if they've been out and about doing exactly what happened in the UK, out in the streets, assuming that bigotry was approved as part of this election, I think we all have a rough idea what would happen if the House turns things around. And to be honest, and this hurts me to say, but I don't think they should either. Now, I've said this before when it comes to the Brexit. There was a process. Everyone knew the rules of that process, and there was a victor. Okay, he's a walking, talking orange douchebag, but that's democracy for you. But if the Democrats and the people aren't happy with that, they firstly need to look at the appalling behaviour of the party to start with. They need to look inside themselves and the appalling turnout of the voters in general. And once that's fixed, then bring in the appropriate amendments to change the electoral college system. I don't think anyone actually really likes it anyway. But if it was designed to ensure that a madman can't get into office, well, Trump isn't the first one to prove that this system doesn't work. But like I say, nothing will surprise me right now. We just have to wait a month or so before we know for sure. Anyway, the final word goes to that who many are already floating for the 46th president, Elizabeth Warren, when she used Dum Dum's own weapon against him and tweeted at him the following: "The President of the United States should condemn bigots, not give them a West Wing office to decide our country's future." Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. Okay, so moving on to skeptical news. Now, I've talked about the failing war on drugs in the past, and I'll refresh on the story that I did on the very first episode, actually, of Skeptic Smash Talk. But even in that very short time, it's become very evident that not only has the war on drugs failed in every aspect, but in areas where authorities have legalized things like pot, there have been positive outcomes from both a health standpoint, but also for the local economy and for real internal revenues also. And I will try not to overly focus on taxation of legalized or decriminalized drugs, as this shouldn't be a major consideration. But let's face it, it's very apparent now that governments care less about public health and more about taxation or lobbyist profits. But we're not doing Skeptic Smash Talk conspiracy theories, so I'll try and stick to what we have in black and white. And the best black and white reference on this subject comes from the British Medical Journal, from an editorial published on the 14th of November titled, "The War on Drugs Has Failed. Doctors Should Lead Calls for Drug Policy Reform." And it also has a very catchy subtitle of "Evidence and Ethics Should Inform Policies That Promote Health and Respect Dignity." I'm pretty much going to read this verbatim, so bear with me. It reads, "People have always consumed psychoactive substances, risking harm. 250 million adults, 1 in 20 worldwide, took an illegal drug such as cannabis, cocaine, or heroin in 2014. A quarter of UK 15-year-olds are estimated to have ever taken an illegal preparation of unknown quality and potency. And most street sex work and much acquisitive crime funds drug trading." And that's a fancy word for money or material goods theft. 3 United Nations treaties, the oldest from 1961, seek to advance the health and welfare of mankind by prohibiting the non-medical use of some drugs. To this end, countries criminalize producers, traffickers, dealers, and users at an annual cost of at least $100 billion US. But the effectiveness of prohibition laws, colloquially known as the war on drugs, must be judged on outcomes. And too often the war on drugs plays out as a war on the millions of people who use drugs, and disproportionately on people who are poor and from ethnic minorities, and on women. Prohibition and stigma encourage less safe drug consumption and push people away from health services. Sharing of injection equipment has led to huge epidemics of blood-borne infections, including HIV and hepatitis. And just 1 in every 6 of the 29 million people worldwide with a drug use disorder received treatment in 2014. At a UN General Assembly in April, many countries asked for health and human rights to be prioritized over punitive responses. And this is what I talked about in episode 1. Many countries have removed criminal penalties for personal drug possession. Portugal replaced criminal sanctions for drug use with civil penalties and health intervention 15 years ago. The UK Psychoactive Substances Act 2016 criminalises importation, production and sale, but not use of these substances. So essentially, you can read that as where some places are tightening up on laws, the UK has been tightening up on them. Reading on. Jurisdictions such as Canada, Uruguay, and several US states, now including California, have gone further to allow regulated non-medical cannabis markets retaking control of supply from organised crime. The Netherlands has tolerated regulated cannabis sales for decades. This year, a thorough review of the international evidence concluded that governments should decriminalise minor drug offences, strengthening health and social sector approaches, move cautiously towards regulated drug markets where possible, and scientifically evaluate the outcomes to build pragmatic and rational policy. Prescription drugs, alcohol, tobacco provide lessons to inform models of regulation. Different drugs with different harms in different contexts may need different approaches, and any change must be supported by investment in evidence-based education, counselling and treatment services to deter drug use and increase safety among users. Health should be at the centre of this debate, and so therefore should healthcare professionals. Doctors are trusted and influential and can bring a rational and humane dimension to ideology and populist rhetoric about being tough on crime. Doctors and their leaders have ethical responsibilities to champion individual and public health, human rights and dignity, and to speak out where health and humanity are being systematically degraded. Change is coming, and doctors should use their authority to lead calls for pragmatic reform informed by science and ethics. Okay, so I think that's a very opportune point to go back to what I said in April, mostly because the person responsible for attempting to change a report on this matter is now the unelected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the same person attempting to embed herself as a pseudo-dictator by still hiding vital information from the Parliament, albeit this time in relation to the Brexit and Article 50 negotiations, but I'll get onto that later. Back to her attempt to remove vital information on the report titled Drugs, International Comparators. So in April, the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, and her aides attempted to delete sentences they didn't agree with from the report on drugs, according to the once Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg. Apparently, the Home Secretary didn't like the conclusions of a report released in 2014, which found no clear link between harsh drug laws and illegal drug use, what we've just been talking about. The report said its fact-finding did not observe any obvious relationship between the toughness of a country's enforcement against drug possession and levels of drug use, sparking requests for further talks regarding decriminalisation. Mr. Clegg, who sits on the Global Commission on Drugs Policy, was one of a number of prominent figures who signed an open letter to the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon urging the UN to review its 20-year campaign to rid the world of illegal drugs. Now, currently, there are about 12,000 people serving sentences directly related to drugs in prisons in the United Kingdom. This costs the government an estimated £480 million per year. The figure for incarceration for indirect drug crimes, so that's where somebody is charged for a related offence, for instance, theft to fund drug dependency, is around 40,000 people. So that's a cost of £1.6 billion per year. In the USA, the war on drugs has been raging since its inception by Richard Nixon in 1971. So to date has been running for 45 years, but it's been estimated that it has only effectively intercepted 15% of the drugs shipped into the USA and probably not effective at all on domestic production. And according to an interview in Harper's earlier this year, one of Richard Nixon's top advisors and key figures in the Watergate scandal said that the war on drugs was created as a political tool to fight blacks and hippies. Now, according to a 22-year-old interview recently published in Harper's Magazine, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. And this was told to a Harper's writer, Dan Baum, from Nixon domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman. In it, he said, "You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war, the Vietnam War, or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities," Ehrlichman said. "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings and vilify them night after night on the evening news." He goes on to say, "Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So if you remember nothing else I ever say from this point on, remember this. The war on drugs was put together to harass the hippies that were protesting that war that America had no need to be in the first place, and the blacks because they had started speaking up for themselves. Anyway, according to a 2008 study published by Harvard economist Jeffrey A. Miron, the annual savings on enforcement and incarceration costs from the legalization of drugs would amount to roughly $41.3 billion US. Miron further estimated that at least $46.7 billion in tax revenue based on rates comparable to those on tobacco and alcohol if the same methods of illegal production and sales were implemented. Not to mention the reductions in costs for medical treatment and social pressures that are associated with criminality. And this is just in the USA. What about the rest of the world? Anyway, so the conclusion of the report that I mentioned at the start, the one Theresa May was so opposed to, were derived from the Portuguese data, where the report found that there had been considerable health improvements since the country began to treat drug possession as a health rather than a criminal issue. And what I will never be able to wrap my head around is why, given all the experience of research and advice from the finest academics and scientists and medical professionals, do our politicians feel they know more than the combined knowledge and experience of these professionals? But there is a new report from the Adam Smith Institute that, well, essentially echoes what I've said at the start of the year, but it goes further, indicating that the British government could net an additional £7 billion per year. And that's net. So not only saving from the cost of incarceration and policing, but the ability to tax and therefore increase internal revenues on these products. And even more amazingly, this report has backing from MPs from all major parties. But most importantly, one of the recommendations closes off the problem that I think is the biggest concern for the kingdom, and that's the wrong people making decisions beyond their kin. As was the case where Mrs. May and her minions tried changing the outcomes of a report to suit them. I'll post the links for the full report, of course, but I will close off with this statement taken from the executive summary of the report. It reads, responsibility for cannabis policy should be moved primarily to the Department for Health, while the role of the Home Office should change from enforcement of prohibition to enforcement of regulation and licensing. So, in religion and humanist news, I have two stories, starting with this one from The Sun and The Independent, and it reads, a British tourist has been arrested and charged with illegal extra-marital sex in Dubai after telling police she had been gang raped. The 25-year-old woman, who cannot be named for obvious reasons, was on holiday in the UAE when she was allegedly attacked by two British men last month. She reported the rape at a police station. She was allegedly arrested for breaking Emirati laws against extramarital sex, while her attackers have since flown home to the UK. The UK-based Detained in Dubai campaign group said that she's been released on bail, but has had her passport confiscated, meaning she cannot leave the country and could face trial for offences with punishments including jail, deportation, flogging, and stoning to death. The group is in contact with the woman's family, who claim the two men took it in turns to rape her while filming the attack in a hotel. She went to the police as the victim, as one of the worst ordeals imaginable, but she is being treated as the criminal. Rada Sterling, the founder and director of Detained in Dubai, said that the case is a tremendously disturbing example of long-running abuses in the holiday resort. She goes on to say, police regularly fail to differentiate between consensual intercourse and violent rape. Victims go to them expecting justice and end up being prosecuted. A spokesman for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office told The Independent it was aware of the case and was providing support to the woman and her relatives, as well as remaining in contact with local authorities. Its travel advice for the UAE says all sexual relations outside marriage are considered illegal, whatever a couple's relationship is at home, alongside homosexual sex and same-sex marriages. it's against the law to live together or to share the same hotel room with somebody of the opposite sex who you are not married or closely related to, the advice states. The laws, which can also see unmarried pregnant women and their partners jailed, have been used to criminalise rape victims, including women from Norway and Australia and several other British victims. The burden of proof for rape under the UAE's interpretation of Sharia law, a confession from the rapist or witness statements from 4 adult men. And all this means that cases that reach court are heavily skewed in the defendant's favour and are frequently dismissed or turned around to prosecute the victim. Okay, so now the victim's mum said, we know who the culprits are, but as far as I'm aware, West Midlands Police aren't doing anything. Okay, so it goes on for a bit more, but you can read the rest via the links in the show notes. And I have to admit, my very first and very wrong thought had been, why do people visit countries like this in the first place? And it's the wrong thought, because we are all fucking humans and should have the same rights wherever we go. That aside, how many times have you heard that the UAE is supposed to be a safe and welcoming place for tourists? But when you dig just a little bit deeper, that's not the case. But why is it that all the draconian laws tend to favour the offender when it's in relation to a crime against a woman? Well, I've got an answer for that. That's because according to all of the main religions, women are property of men. Hence, in the case, the victim needs 4 adult men to stand witness. And that's nothing but fucking revolting. But just to make sure that nobody points out how fucked up these laws are, if you highlight this problem, you are also accused of blasphemy or apostasy, which will easily see you put to death, all for the crime of having penis deficit disorder. And while we're talking about the lack of rights for the property of men, if you remember last year, a High Court ruled that Northern Ireland's abortion ban is a breach of human rights legislation. But as it stands right now, in Northern Ireland, abortion is still illegal and carries a life sentence. So how very fucking progressive you are, you potato-munching troglodytes. But Nicola Sturgeon has said the Scottish government will look into the possibility of giving Northern Irish women free abortion. The Scottish First Minister told the Scots Parliament she's considering the proposal. She told the Chamber, I'm happy to explore with the NHS what the situation is now in terms of the availability of women from Northern Ireland to access safe and legal abortions in the NHS in Scotland and whether any improvements can be made. She said, I believe that women should have the right to choose within the limits that are currently set down in law and that right should be defended. When a woman opts to have an abortion, the procedure should be available in a safe and legal way. And in addition to being illegal to have an abortion in Northern Ireland, Northern Irish women are not entitled to free NHS abortions when they travel to England for the procedures and instead have to pay for this via private healthcare. The Supreme Court is currently considering a legal challenge brought by a Northern Irish woman arguing it's discriminatory for NHS England to refuse Northern Ireland women abortions as they are UK citizens. However, the NHS has argued that as the procedure is banned locally, they are not entitled to procedures in England either. So let me clear up a little bit of confusion there for anyone not a part of this strange kingdom of ours. Great Britain, or Britain for simplicity, is the name of the island that I'm currently on. That's got England, Wales and Scotland separated by lines on a map. The United Kingdom is Britain and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales and England are all separate countries currently under the rule of Her Majesty's government. In England, the Republic of Ireland is the majority of the island of Ireland and has nothing to do with the UK at all apart from having a convenient location for Liverpudlians to go on holiday and to still feel that they are in a foreign country because the money's different. Anyway, this is something that our friends in America are probably quite used to, especially the ones living around the various tri-state areas where you can border hop to get better local tax rates on certain goods. I can't remember exactly where it was, and remind me if you do know, I think it was Oregon and Washington. One doesn't have state income tax, the other doesn't have state sales tax. So if you lived in one and worked in the other, you could not pay income tax in one, then hop the border and go and do your big grocery shop and not have to pay sales tax. And it's probably a little bit more complicated than that, but you get my point. But none of that's my real point, so let's get to it. Because of a line on the map, a loyal and honourable citizen of Her Majesty the Queen is not only unable to get medical procedures that every other person in the kingdom can receive without repercussions and without paying a charge as a part of what actually is a pretty brilliant welfare system, but if they do so, they can and often are charged as a criminal. So think of it this way. Surrounding London, there is a ring road called the M25. And on my map, it's nothing more than a line. So can you imagine, especially for my listener in London, if the laws were different depending on what side of that line, or road as it happens to be in this case, you were on or in? What if Londoners paid more tax or got different medical treatments as a part of the system? What if there was a certain medical procedure that was only available inside the ring that encapsulates London? But what if you were an outer ringer? You weren't able to have access to it. Or if you did, it would be at an exorbitant cost, even though you pay into the same insurance fund as the rest of the kingdom. Now, that obviously wouldn't happen in London, but because Northern Ireland has a geographical separation to the rest of the kingdom, they seem to be able to get away with this. And I do want to make a few comments on abortions while I have that door open. To start with, you may have noticed that this is not a topic I generally discuss, and there's a reason for that, and I'll get to that in a moment. But there's something that really pisses me off when it comes to, well, if ever the topic of abortion is talked about in public, well, in my echo chamber anyway, most people I know, and again, this is in my echo chamber, most people I know either think it's an individual's choice or don't believe there should be restrictive abortion laws. But there are a few that think that a woman shouldn't have abortions for any reasons. And to be frank, I can't be arguing with that statement. And even though I know I can sway them if I had even an inkling, even just to the point that they should be allowed in certain circumstances, but all that does is reinforce their opinion that abortions are wrong, albeit with severe restrictions. But what these people don't figure into their dogmatic viewpoint is that abortions are not compulsory. To use the American lexicon for the side of the argument, it's called pro-choice. It's a choice that the woman gets to make for herself. If she decides against it because of her beliefs, well, that's her choice to do so. The key word is choice. And again, to go back to the Yankee lexicon, the pro-life argument is always based around religious foundations. And if my research is wrong on this, get in touch with me and let me know. But I don't know of a single anti-abortion movement that doesn't have its roots deeply wrapped around religion. And I mention this now because in the last story when I said that all the major religions treat all the not men as property, several of your heads exploded. But it's the men in the churches that force these dogmatic principles into laws that are based on nothing but ancient stories of a magical sky daddy that impregnated a woman without her consent. And the teachings from their book, such as this from one Timmy. It reads, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." Timmy also gives us, but even though women are inferior to men, they shouldn't be discouraged because they shall be saved in childbearing. In other words, if you have penis deficit disorder, shut the fuck up and make babies and make sure they all have cocks.
Hello, it is me again, the voiceover robot, while he has his blood pressure tablets. Don't forget to go to skepticsmashtalk.com for show notes and contact details. Also, don't you think my voice is more soothing than Jason's?
Okay, and finally for this week, we turn to Britain and its supreme leaders and their plan for Brexit, or as it turns out, lack of plan for Brexit. According to a leaked document, up to 30,000 new civil servants are needed to be hired to cope with the immense workload generated by Brexit. according to a report that found Theresa May's government has no coherent plan for Britain's departure from the European Union. The leaked document obtained by The Times, titled Brexit Update, warns that a recruitment drive was progressing too slowly because of threats from the Cabinet Office and Treasury that departments will have to make existing budgets cover the costs. Despite extended debate amongst permanent secretaries, no common strategy has emerged, says the memo, warning that more than 500 Brexit-related projects were beyond the capacity and capability of the government. It also criticises the Prime Minister for drawing indecisions and details to settle matters herself amid cabinet splits between the three leading Leave campaigners, and that's Foreign Secretary Boris the Fat Malfoy Johnson, Brexit Secretary David Brexit Davis, and International Trade Secretary Liam, I haven't got a funny name for him yet, Fox, on one side, and Chancellor Philip Hammond and Business Secretary Greg Clark on the other. The report warns that big companies will point a gun at the government's head after Nissan was given assurances about trading conditions once Britain leaves the EU. Tim Farron, the Lib Democrat leader, called for the government to urgently answer key questions on the terms of Brexit, including the common market. This shambles at the heart of government confirms that the only reason Theresa May won't tell us her Brexit plan is because she doesn't have one, he said. Her government is heading for the worst possible outcome, a reckless, destructive Brexit that will do untold damage to British jobs and the economy. In response to the report, a government spokesperson said, "This is not a government report and we don't recognise the claims made by it." And I remind you of earlier on in this episode when Mrs. May and her select few like to do what they like to do and change reports they don't agree with. Anyway, this leaked report came at exactly the right time last week so that it would be raised at Prime Minister's question times in the House of Commons. And as it's become her habit, she deliberately and blatantly didn't answer any of the questions put to her on this document, or any questions on Brexit for that matter. And as an aside, I suggest that if you're interested in how elected or otherwise officials act in the House, PM question time is about the best time to watch their behaviour. Anyway, that aside, there's an official procedure and certain rules that must be obeyed. But essentially, each Wednesday at noon, members and the leader of the opposition get to ask the PM some questions. And this is where the behaviour of the House can be utterly pathetic. Last week, for example, most, but not all questions from the PM's own party were actually statements seeking affirmation. For instance, one Tory MP said the following as a question, and I quote, he said, "Last Tuesday, I attended an infection prevention and control summit that highlighted the great work done by the Department of Health, the NHS and other organisations dramatically to decrease MRSA infection rates, yet also raise a growing threat of E. coli and sepsis." And then we get to the question. She goes on, "Will my right honourable friend join me in commending such events and outline the government strategy for combating superbugs?" This was followed up by another one of her trained Muppets when they said the following, "Will the Prime Minister join me in welcoming today's news that the unemployment rate has fallen to an 11-year low? Will she join me in thanking all of those businesses that created jobs such as Jennifer Ash and Son Hugh's funeral home on Brown Hill Street in my constituency I was kindly asked to open last week?" How the fuck are these questions? These are statements and an absolute waste of time, especially given that they need to hold a ballot for backbenchers to ask questions. Anyway, in both these and similar instances, Mrs. May went on into a bit of detail on how awesome her team had done. But when the leader of the opposition, or anyone else for that matter, asked questions about Brexit, Mrs. May regurgitated nearly verbatim each time the same thing, but I'll paraphrase. She would say along the lines of, "We are doing the preparations necessary for the point at which we will start the complex formal negotiations with the European Union," followed each time and every time by some sort of ad hominem attack on the questioner. And you can read all of it for yourself if you like. They always post the transcripts online pretty much the same day. Anyway, I have a soundbite here. It starts with Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition, followed by the Prime Minister. This is how both houses behave. And don't forget to listen out for the attack at the end.
We have an international development secretary who's opposed to overseas aid. We have a health secretary who is running down our national health service. We have a chancellor with no fiscal strategy. We have a Lord Chancellor who seems to have difficulty defending the judiciary. We have a Brexit team with no plan for Brexit, and as has just been shown, we have a Prime Minister who is not prepared to answer questions on what the actual Brexit strategy is. We need a better answer than she's given us.
I'll tell the right honourable gentleman what we've got. We've got an International Development Secretary delivering on this government's commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on international development. We've got a Health Secretary delivering on £10 billion extra funding for the health service. And we've got a Chancellor of the Exchequer making sure we have the stable economy that creates the wealth necessary to pay for our public services. But what we certainly have got is a leader of the opposition who's incapable of leading.
Anyway, in other Brexit news, Lady Hale, one of the Supreme Court judges hearing the government's appeal against the legal challenge to Brexit next month, has said a simple act of Parliament may not be sufficient to start the process, arguing a comprehensive replacement of the 1972 Act may be needed. Now, where else have you heard that, my dear listeners? Perhaps in episode 26 and 27, and maybe in number 30. Anyway, she's also stated that the EU referendum was not legally binding. Lady Hale made the comments in a speech to lawyers in Kuala Lumpur, during which she reflected on the upcoming case. And she said that all parties in the litigation accept the referendum is not legally binding following the referendum result. A government promise made 6 years prior resurfaced that any referendum cannot be legally binding, but rather is advisory. Anyway, and as much as we all thought we knew what the appeal argument was at the start of last week, I've heard whispers that the government is changing its argument. But as of this recording, nobody actually knows what that argument may be. But in another Supreme Court decision late last week, it's been ruled that the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly will get to have their say on the Article 50. And while the Welsh voted a fair majority to leave the EU, every constituency in Scotland voted to remain. So now counsel for the Scottish government will be allowed to argue that Brexit is likely to have a decisive impact on the devolution settlement and the law in Scotland, which means, as is the case with the High Court decision, the Parliament, the whole Parliament, including the House of Lords, which the government have threatened to muzzle if they don't behave themselves, must vote on this. And if you've missed seeing or hearing anything on that last part, the government threatening the Lords, you're not alone. Everyone's been really, really quiet on that one. But the last person to successfully shackle the powers of the Lords was Ollie Cromwell. You remember him. He was that guy that didn't like the monarchy or anything that the monarchy stood for. So he had the king's head separated from his body and then went on to become Lord Protector for life, being referred to as Your Highness, and all the other pleasantries bestowed upon a king of the day, including the succession of his titles and his powers to his heir into the position. But no, they weren't a monarchy. That's what the 9 years of war and hundreds of thousands of deaths were for, to rid the kingdom of its monarchy. So I guess we have an example there of what we would call today normal post-truth politics. And we still really don't actually know what Brexit actually means, or do we? I may have found a hidden clue. See if you can hear it.
Now, naturally, people want to know what Brexit will mean.
Brexit means Brexit.
Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit.
Brexit means Brexit.
Brexit means
Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. I think the honourable gentleman first of all should just accept that Brexit means Brexit. So yes, Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Is that it? We must move on. Brexit means Brexit. 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 Brexit means
Brexit.
Brexit means Brexit.
Brexit means breakfast.
Brexit means breakfast.
Breakfast. Brexit. Brexit does mean breakfast.
So in closing, I'd simply say this. Brexit means Brexit.
So is everyone clear about what Brexit means then?
Breakfast.
Okay, well, I think that's about enough, but very briefly, if you remember in episode 36, I talked about some of the struggles that I had at QEDCon. Well, the organisers had got in touch with me. I may have mentioned this before, actually, anyway, but I caught up with Mike Hall last week and he run through some ideas with me to see if they will help. Okay, I won't say what they are just in case they may not be possible, but if they're able to come to pass, these ideas will make a big difference to me and other people with strange brains like mine. So when they announce this, I'll be sure to let you know, just in case you're a little bit like me and think that you would like to go to QED next time. Anyway, so that is enough for this week. Don't forget to check out the show notes for all the links. And if you want to read in depth any of the reports that I mentioned today, you can find all of those in the show notes as well at skepticsmashtalk.com. You can also follow me and lols me on the Facebook. Just search for Skeptic Smash Talk on Facebook, or the links are on the homepage as well. And as always, you can find me on Twitter, and you can send me feedback and hate mail to skepticsmashtalk@gmail.com. Now, with all that said, I guess it's time where I say good night and have a good week. I've been Jason Jones, and until next time, this has been Skeptic Smash Talk.
So is everyone clear about what Brexit means then?
Breakfast.